This week on the APUSHow, we see Chapter 4, The Empire in Transition. Remember, in the early days of colonial America, we see three major groups. We see Europeans, we see natives, and we see Africans. And we see a new identity emerge of colonials, Europeans, natives, and Africans, and things start to get messy. Who will the natives support? Europeans or colonials? French or British? To what extent can the Europeans get the colonials to serve their needs? How did early experiments in government rooted in the ideas of the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment lead to increased questioning of European authority? We'll just have to wait and find out. As we look in this chapter, we see loosening ties between the British government and their colonies in North America, the struggle for a continent between Britain and France. We see new imperialism emerge from Great Britain over the North American colonies. We see the stirring of revolt. We see the cooperation between the colonies for kind of the first time, and eventually, war. And Taft will show his butt for the bulk of the lecture. So before we get into this week's episode of the APUSHow, I'm just going to warn you that Taft has really gotten into imperial intervention in colonial affairs and the complicated nature of the tightening of imperial grip on the colonies. And he may interrupt every now and again because he's so excited about it. So I apologize for his behavior in advance. So anyway, we start with talking about loosening ties. Yes, I know, the loosening ties between imperialist Great Britain and the colonies. I know, Taft. After the Glorious Revolution, there was a series of ineffectual Georges, that is, King George I and King George II. They made the monarchy a whole lot weaker, and because of that, power went to the Parliament, who were way more concerned with winning votes and keeping power meant keeping the various merchants and landowners happy, and the way you kept them happy was to ensure that their colonial interests were met, and that meant loosening various laws, loosening various policies, loosening various regulations, as well as easing taxation on the colonies. At that time, there really wasn't any specific office or person that was responsible for how to deal with the colonies. It was really just a bunch of other offices that were responsible for many other things, and they generally focused on those other things rather than focusing on the colonies. Royal officials who were supposed to be governing the colonies at the time were also really incompetent or corrupt. Most of them were hired via bribes or favoritism, and most dealt with the colonies through negligence or corruption. Basically, an official or wealthy merchant from the colonies would bribe them to ensure that various laws or taxes were ignored. And because of this, this created a power vacuum. And a power vacuum is where nobody is in charge, and because nobody is in charge, people kind of fill that void informally, and usually that was in the form of colonial legislatures. They became little countries in and of themselves, so people may consider themselves a Massachusetts man or a North Carolina man or something like that. However, it's important to note that though colonials began to feel more independent, they still felt more British than connected to other colonies. There is a famous quote from a merchant from this era who said that fire and water are not more heterogeneous than the different colonies in North America. Taft, what do you think that means? That's completely right. Well done. You're a very smart beast, despite your faults. It basically meant that they really didn't feel a great deal of connection to one another, but they did have a sense that they were British. So, for example, people from Connecticut often thought that people from New York were frauds or unfair and kind of shifty, whereas people from New York thought that people from Connecticut were stupid. They might kind of feel that way. But anyway, they could barely get a postal service going, they being the various colonies, and they barely could communicate with one another, so there wasn't a whole lot of cohesion between the colonies. They couldn't even really muster enough strength to fight off the French and native allies consistently, and because of that, colonial leaders met in Albany, New York to try and do something about that. One of those leaders was Benjamin Franklin, and he proposed a plan to have one general government over all the colonies, and that government's one job was dealing with the natives. All other local constitutions and laws would be left alone. They would only deal with the natives. Those in Albany tentatively agreed to the plan, but when they brought it back to their states, it was rejected, and that led to the famous quote by Ben Franklin, who is pictured there in the slide with that very cool coonskin cap. Taft is really into coonskin caps. But he said, "Everyone cries, a union is necessary, but when they come to the manner and form of the union, their weak noodles are perfectly distracted." He meant noodles in the sense of head, not necessarily something else. And all this talk of noodles has Taft feeling like he doesn't want to have any part of this episode. And out of this comes a struggle for the continent being North America. And that struggle was between France, England, and the natives who obviously were living there at the time. France and England would be the world's top two imperialist nations at that time. Spain was starting to fall off in terms of their global dominance, but France and England were the big dogs at that time, and they clashed during what became known as the 7 Years' War, which is actually 9 years when we consider the conflict in North America. The balance of power between the British, French, and Iroquois nations was precarious. The 1750s really messed that entire delicate balance that they had and led to a fragile dominance of the British over the northeastern part of North America. Before this, France had expanded its influence over North America. France had some fur trappers and traders who lived in the interior of North America and in the areas now known as Canada, but that was about it. The French king at that time, Louis XIV, wanted to expand France's influence throughout the world, and because of that, more traders arrived in North America and more forts were established, which is how we get cities like Montreal and Quebec, cities that still speak French to this day. And this is a big reason why. These are where their roots are. And they also established plantations with slaves, which were built, and that's how we get cities in the South like Mobile, Biloxi, and New Orleans. Those cities still have a fair degree of French influence in their culture. The Iroquois nation, on the other hand, they tried to play neutral to a degree, and they tried to play the English and French off of one another. And they avoid having close ties with either, and they tried to use this position to assert themselves as the most powerful confederacy of natives in northeastern North America, and it succeeded for a while. And we would see that the conflict would expand into North America, as I had mentioned previously. Europe and France were competing rivals. One would expand, the other would feel encroached upon, and then war would break out. And that happened somewhat repeatedly and reared its ugly head in North America. Or they would have alliances with other European kingdoms, and those kingdoms would fight, and England and France would get dragged in, and so would their colonies, which is where we are in terms of the conflict in North America. And all this resulted in a young, inexperienced colonel named George Washington. You might hear about him later, maybe, perchance. What do you think of that, Taft? Or Taft's butt? Anyway, young George Washington was ordered to challenge a French expansion into the Ohio Valley near the modern-day city of Pittsburgh. He was supposed to basically attack and take over a French outpost. He set up this little encampment called Fort Necessity, which was kind of laughably small by modern standards, and tried to wage an attack on the French. He failed. It did not work very well, and the conflict between the French and the English and the natives began, though this would be called the French and Indian War, which was kind of a misleading name because it makes you think that the French and natives were fighting against each other, when in reality the French and natives were fighting against the English, and the English also had natives on their side as well. But they would call it the French and Indian War because from their view it seemed like they were fighting the French and the natives, or as they called them, the Indians. The French and Indian War sort of preceded what was known as the 7 Years' War, which was in a lot of ways kind of the First World War by some accounts, as it did expand over 3 continents. It was fought in North America, it was fought in Africa, and it was fought in Asia. Ironically enough, the 2 countries fighting, which were both European countries, didn't bother to fight in their own continent. I guess the whole phrase of don't poop where you eat certainly applied there. Don't fight war where you live. Guess that applies. At the outset of the war, England was losing. They failed to stop the French from gaining reinforcement, and an English general, General Edward Braddock, failed to take an early area in the Ohio Valley. Because of this, many natives saw that the tide was sort of shifting towards the French, and so they sided with the French, because it's way better to back a winner than it is to back a loser. Many native tribes had better relationship with the French anyway, so they sided with them. This caused England to shift their leadership and gave William Pitt the job of trying to take charge of the war. And he does well, but he does so at a cost. He forces the colonials to fight in the war, and he takes upon a practice known as impressment. Impressment is where you literally force people to fight. It's almost like kidnapping them and forcing them to fight. And this made people really, really mad. And on top of that, the colonials were expected to give supplies and shelter to British troops when asked. So if you lived during this time, a British troop could come to your house, knock on your door, and said, "Hey, I need a place to sleep." And you got to give them a place to sleep. All of this on top of each other made people really angry, made people mad, made people big mad, made people riot mad, as in New York, there was a riot in 1757. As a result of all of this unrest, William Pitt relaxed many of these policies and agreed to reimburse a lot of the supplies that colonials lost. The war really turned after some capable maneuvering by British leadership. General James Wolfe becomes somewhat of the famous figure from this, mostly from a painting that shows him dying, which we're going to look at right now, and our boatload of bias. See if you can see the bias in this painting. That was a fun boatload of bias. Though the British won the war and it was depicted in a very romantic fashion, there's a lot of things that weren't so romantic about it. One, they dispersed thousands of French inhabitants who had to relocate all the way to the southern part of what is now the United States, to New Orleans, and those people were known as Acadians, but then they would be known as Cajuns down south, and they still have a thriving culture to this day. And English and colonial troops offered brutal, disgusting bounties for scalps. In case you don't know what a scalp is literally when the top of your head is cut off, just kind of leaving your skin and hair as proof that a native was killed. And the reason they wanted the natives killed, because a lot of them were suspected of being loyal to the French. The fighting could have gone on, except the most recent monarch, King George III, called off hostilities, though William Pitt wanted to keep going and take all of French territory as he could. As a result of the loss in the French and Indian War, France ceded some Caribbean islands. They gave away most of Canada and pretty much all French territory east of the Mississippi River. They did not give up New Orleans, though, which would prove to be a very strategic city within the North American continent. The war was a huge victory for England, but it did have its cost. One, it put England heavily into debt. Two, it made many British military personnel very resentful of the colonists because they felt that the colonists didn't really contribute much personally or financially for a war that really benefited them more than anybody else. And it built a communal feeling among the colonists who fought and supported the war effort against their first truly common enemy against the British colonies, that enemy being France. And that feeling of camaraderie was just among the colonists. It was not among the English regulars. And that would grow and grow and end up sort of working against the British when revolutionary spirits would gain more traction. The natives fared absolutely horribly. Because so many natives allied themselves with the French, many found themselves victims of British retaliation. The Iroquois nation, because it stayed mostly neutral, found their alliance with Britain to be unraveled, and the nation itself would unravel shortly thereafter. As a result of the French and Indian War, there was a new form of imperialism. Yes, Taft, there is going to be a tighter squeeze on the colonies, as we may see. Good for you. Chill on the pointing out of imperialism. I know you're excited. Anyway, as a result of the French and Indian War, England found itself with a huge empire at peace, but it also found itself with a huge amount of war debt, which meant that they were going to need to involve themselves more so with the colonies in the form of taxation and policies. Yes, Taft, I get it. Greater control. I know. You're super excited about that, and I'm glad you're identifying that. But we have to move on. The colonials are going to come to hate this taxation, even when it came from their own assemblies. And there was a big debate at that time between the idea of commercial and territorial imperialism. Territorial imperialism was essentially the idea that you take over land so that people could more easily expand and thus conduct business. It's kind of the imperialism we're more used to. You take over an area and it becomes yours. However, there's also commercial imperialism, in which you don't necessarily take over an area, you just make sure you are the only ones who have access to the markets in an area. You don't really care who owns the land, you just care that you are the only ones who can get access to the resources and you have the only access to the markets there. Eventually, the territorial imperialists won, as a lot of colonials wanted greater room to expand. The king at that time, King George III, remember, the previous George were really stinky at being king and Parliament kind of ruled for the most part. Well, King George III was also not all that great. Georges seemed to just not be very good at being king at this time. But King George III was very young and immature when he became king. And not only that, he was not exactly the brightest fellow in the world. And because of that, he often overcompensated by trying to seem more smart than he actually was and trying to do too much and to sort of show that he was in charge when in reality he was not. He also suffered from a rare genetic disorder which caused him to become deranged for extended periods of time. Apparently, he would do things like speak nonstop for hours on end until his voice went hoarse. He often repeated himself and would foam at the mouth. You bite your tongue, sir. You bite your tongue. He even was rumored to have shaken hands with a tree once, thinking that he was shaking hands with the King of Prussia. Going back to the colonies, as more settlers looked to expand their territories westward, the natives, of course, got upset at this and conflict began to escalate. Fearing greater conflict, the proclamation of 1763 limited colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The natives were pretty ambivalent about this proclamation, as they wanted zero white encroachment at all, but at least liked the idea of limited white encroachment. However, the proclamation didn't really do a whole lot, as white encroachment continued with little control from the British Empire. And to further tax and control the colonies, the British indoctrinated a few acts, most notably the Sugar, Currency, and Stamp Acts. These acts were meant to control colonial economy for the benefit of Great Britain. The Sugar Act taxed the sale and purchase of sugar and forbade colonies from selling it to anyone except for Great Britain. The Currency Act stopped the printing of new paper money. Yeah, they sort of had paper money at that time, but they limited it in order to stop inflation and instability. Sorry, Taft. No more beaver skins really getting traded on a large scale. I know, such a bummer. And yes, another example of further imperial control. But anyway, the stamp tax taxed all printed documents. Remember, you had to have a lot of documents to prove you own stuff or various things you sort of do in life. Buy a house, there had to be a document that you own that house. Owned a business, had to be a document you own that business. Get married, had to be a document that proved you were married. And all those documents had to be stamped with the seal of approval from the British government. And in order to get that seal of approval, you had to pay a tax. So it's really a fee to have proper licensure. These acts were really successful in easing the war debt for Great Britain, but also very successful in making colonists really mad. Resistance to control and taxation came against the colonial governments first from the back country. Think of Bacon's rebellion. The backcountry is oftentimes the leaders for people who are upset with further taxation and regulation. We have the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania and the regulators in North Carolina. The Paxton Boys marched on Philadelphia and did get some concessions after their confrontation with the government there. The regulators took things a little bit further and started a small civil war, but eventually got put down by the militia in Pennsylvania, and the leaders of that were hanged. What added to the instability was a post-war depression. During the French and Indian War, England was pumping a ton of money into the colonies, but when the war ended, that money supply stopped, which led to a depression in the economy and made people more anxious, as depressions always do. The consequences of all these acts, policies, and interventions led to an increased desire for home rule, and in some circles, perhaps even rebellion. But before we have a revolution, we have a Stamp Act crisis. And the Stamp Act crisis came not because the Stamp Act was expensive, it was because that people were upset that there was a tax just to raise revenue for the crown. People didn't like essentially being a source of cash for Great Britain. It made colonists big mad. Yeah, Taft. Further pushback against imperial control. We get it. We get it. In Virginia, members of the House of Burgesses, especially a guy by the name of Patrick Henry, remember that name because he's a big deal, stated that no one except colonial governments had the right to tax the colonies, and therefore all taxes that came from anywhere else should be ignored. The Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts shared that same sentiment, and anti-British activities started by the Sons of Liberty attacked pro-British supporters, they attacked stamp collectors, and anyone who didn't participate in a growing sugar boycott to protest against British taxation. Because of all of this pushback, Parliament decided to repeal the Stamp Act, but on the same day passed the Declaratory Act, which gave Parliament ultimate authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Tenant farmers also rebelled against large estate owners, so here we see colonials rebelling against colonials. Rebellion was just in the air, Taft. They rebelled because they believed they should own their own land that they worked, and they felt that their landowners were being unfair. The most famous of those revolts would be Ethan Allen in Vermont, which is still part of New York back then. Vermont was owned by wealthy New York landlords, and the revolt succeeded as Vermont became its own state, and the estates within Vermont were broken up a bit, and a lot more people got to own their own land. And this leads us to the Townsend Program, which is named for a guy by the name of Charles Townsend, who ruled the colonies for Prime Minister William Pitt, who was made prime minister essentially because he is the hero of the French and Indian War, but he was very old and very senile, but still a hero to a lot of the colonials and a lot of the British. But under the Townsend Program, we have the Mutiny or Quartering Act of 1765, in which you still had to give the British troops food and shelter if they asked for it, and this made people really mad. They didn't really care about giving British troops food and shelter, they just cared that they had to do it. Townsend also tried to only levy external taxes, which meant that they only taxed things that were brought in from England. Colonists had said earlier that they failed to see the logic in taxing things produced only inside the colonies. And colonies hated external taxes too, because remember what Patrick Henry said, the idea of taxes should only come from the colonists themselves. Well, anyway, all these led to boycotts, and then Townsend died in 1767, and power over the colonies fell to the new Prime Minister, Lord North, who repealed the Townsend Acts. However, joy from the repeal of the Townsend Act didn't have time to take hold because of the Boston Massacre. A little context for us. Before the Boston Massacre occurred, there was growing tension between the British soldiers and colonials. This was experienced mostly because British soldiers began taking jobs from colonials and also later on began shooting the colonials too. Well, this led to hostilities, and then in one spring day, there were hostilities at a ship rigging factory that spilled into the evening. A lot of colonial ship workers were mad that British ship workers were taking their jobs. Later that night, a bunch of drunk colonials began to spill out into the streets of Boston and began throwing rocks and snowballs at a British customs building in the middle of Boston. Well, British troops went to go protect that building, and the colonials were throwing rocks and throwing snowballs at the building and at the British soldiers. In the middle of the chaos, a British soldier was knocked down by either a rock or a club or a snowball and responded by opening fire, and then the other British soldiers opened fire as well, killing 5 colonials, including a member of the crowd who was black by the name of Crispus Attucks. He was a black sailor and is one of the first people considered as dying for the country. Well, needless to say, many colonists were quick to sensationalize the event as an act of coordinated British aggression, when in reality, it was just a very chaotic situation in which somebody reacted badly and opened fire when they probably shouldn't have. Wonder if anything like that has happened any time around here. I don't know. What's that? Oh, yeah, that. I guess there was that, yeah. But anyway, in terms of how the trial went, the British soldiers were tried and were actually acquitted of murder. They were found that the situation was chaotic and they were kind of egged on to shoot, and the chaos sort of found them to be unculpable of a coordinated murderous attack. And interestingly enough, their lawyer was John Adams, who would be one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Samuel Adams, who was actually a distant relative of John Adams, would be the main one to popularize dissent against the British and spoke up frequently and started a committee of correspondence that publicized grievances against the British and corresponded with other colonies who had similar grievances against the British. And though there was relative calm in the early 1770s, a spirit of revolution grew underneath the veneer of peace. Ideas regarding how a government should function, ironically, came from England itself, and that fueled a lot of the revolutionary spirit. For example, England had a system of checks and balances. In England, they have the king, they have a parliament that is consisted of 2 branches. You have a House of Lords, which is the aristocratic part, and you have a House of Commons, which is everybody who is not aristocratic. And one could keep another group from gaining too much power. So the House of Lords could override the House of Commons, the House of Commons could override the monarchy, and it's just a nice system of checks and balances. And there was also arguments over how people should be represented within the empire. There was this idea between virtual and actual representation. Virtual representation meant that every member of parliament represents everybody in the empire. So if you're a member of parliament and you were elected by a bunch of people from Newcastle, England, you represent people living in British North America too, because you represent everyone. Whereas the actual representation is the idea that the member of parliament represents the people that elected him. And it is a him because women weren't allowed to be members of parliament at that time. But that meant if you were living in British North America, you elected your person who represented you, and they represented you above all else. Eventually, the virtual idea would emerge as the most popular one within the empire, and of course that's going to make members of British North America upset. And then after years of spreading revolutionary writing and culture, a Tea Act emerged that really reignited revolutionary passions. What's interesting about the Tea Act is it actually didn't raise the price of tea, and it didn't actually inflict a new tax on tea. What it actually did was allow the British East India Company, which was an actual company within England, to sell tea exclusively to the colonies without having to pay a duty tax that everyone else normally had to pay. So the British East India Company got a special exception. Other tea merchants thought this was unfair, spread their dissent among the colonies, and it led to a full-on tea boycott. Colonials tried to stop the tea-carrying ships from even getting into the colonies, and when they did, they often forced the ships to just sit in harbor without ever being able to unload their tea, because they refused to buy them and refused people to even sell them. And the most famous protest occurred when one of these ships holding the tea, which was just sitting in the harbor, was boarded by a bunch of protesters dressed as Native Americans, and they then threw several boxes of tea from the British East India Company into the Boston Harbor, to the delight of a crowd that was watching nearby and actually protecting them from any British soldiers who may have gone to try and stop them. This act led to even harsher treatment of Massachusetts by the British Crown in what is known as the Coercive Acts. And then this led to more colonial boycotts and greater resentment between England and the colonials. And this leads us to our next section on cooperation and war. In order for there to be a revolution, there has to be a ton of organization. Now, a lot of that organization came in the form of local governments, as they already began to emerge as local autonomy was very strong. Yes, Taft, we know that there was a lot of trying to assert control over colonies that had been kind of existing autonomously for a while, and now this is going to lead to problems. Yes, we get it. We totally get it. Can we go on? Thanks. Sheesh. And then out of the committees of correspondence, which has been started in a large degree by Patrick Henry and members of the Massachusetts colony, colonial assemblies began to emerge more and more, and they all agreed, except for Georgia, to meet as a First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. And as you look at that picture, notice the race and gender of all of the members of the First Continental Congress. No women, no people of color at all, no Native Americans, and the 325,000 African slaves living in the colonies were not represented and scarcely considered, which is very interesting when we see all of the rhetoric about not wanting to be beholden to the British crown without a hint of irony that there was still a huge portion of the people living in North America who were kept as slaves. And this is one of the issues of hypocrisy that we see in the early American Revolution. But I digress. In response to the First Continental Congress, Lord North, who was the Prime Minister at the time, instituted the conciliatory propositions, which really weren't all that conciliatory. What they did was put the onus of taxation on the colonies themselves. The idea being that they could divide the moderate colonists who would want to tax people and gain better favor with the British government and perhaps dissuade a revolution. The British government would set the rate of taxation, and the colonists had to collect the money themselves. However, the proposition from Lord North did not make it to the colonies in time, as shots were fired in Lexington and Concord before it ever even got there. The Revolutionary War starts in Lexington and Concord, at least the war in terms of fighting and killing people in that sense. It started when the British General Gage suspected Massachusetts Minutemen. They were called Minutemen because they were militia people who were expected to be able to arrive and fight at a minute's notice, were storing weapons in the city of Lexington in Massachusetts. The fighting began when General Gage began to move troops to Lexington, but watchmen in Boston saw this troop movement and began to warn colonials further inland about the incoming troops coming from Boston. And this is most made famous by the poem Paul Revere's Ride. But it was actually a guy by the name of William Dawes, who was there on the left. He's not the guy stroking his chin very gallantly like Paul Revere, who actually did most of the writing. The only reason why Paul Revere is more famous today than William Dawes? More stuff rhymes with Revere than Dawes. Because of William Dawes and Paul Revere's warning, American troops were able to meet the British regulars at Lexington, and fighting broke out in Lexington, then in Concord on the same day of April 19, 1775. As a result of the fighting, 73 British troops and 49 colonial troops died. Both sides claim that the other side fired first because it was much better to be the ones who didn't fire first because it was a lot easier to justify fighting then. However, the colonials were able to get their story out much more quickly, and the call to war was sounded. And though it was not totally apparent that a war was going to break out, because there had been a little fighting beforehand, think of the Boston Massacre, it did prove that these two battles at Lexington and Concord would be the outbreak of a Revolutionary War and would therefore be the beginning of the American Revolution. And that wraps up our Chapter 4 recap for this week. Tune in next week when we will go to Chapter 5 and look at the details of the American Revolution. And as this is being released, I just want to say Feliz cumpleaños to our vecinos del sur. That means happy birthday to our neighbors to the south, as it is Mexican Independence Day, September 16th. And by the way, Mexican Independence Day is on September 16th, not May 5th. Try not to make that mistake. Thanks for watching, and don't forget, we gotta keep pushing, G.